There are people who hate their birthdays. They don't celebrate them, they don't mention them. They even prefer to disappear on that day. But why does a date that should be happy generate discomfort, rejection, or anxiety? Why do some people feel pressure where others feel joy? And most importantly, what does this behavior reveal about their emotional history and their way of relating to others? Today, we aren't going to talk about parties, but about what psychology hides behind those who prefer to spend their birthdays in silence. When an adult decides not to celebrate their birthday, in many cases the root is not in the present, but in childhood. It is not a sudden choice or a simple personal preference. It is the result of an emotional experience that was repeated too many times when they didn't yet have the words to explain it. Imagine a child who waits for their birthday with excitement. They count the days, imagine the cake, the gifts, the attention. But the day arrives and passes like any other. No one mentions it, no one stops, no one remembers. At first it hurts, the second time it's confusing, the third time something changes inside the child. They no longer wait, they learn. Psychology calls this learned helplessness. It is the moment when the brain understands that waiting for something positive only leads to disappointment. Then it activates a protection mechanism. Stop wanting, because when you don't expect anything, you don't get hurt. Over time, that child stops asking. They stop getting excited. And most importantly, they stop considering their birthday as something relevant. Not because it doesn't matter, but because the pain of waiting was too high. In adulthood, this wound is not consciously remembered. There is no clear memory that says, "No one celebrated my birthday." But the body remembers it. The nervous system remembers it. Every time that date approaches, an uncomfortable feeling appears, difficult to explain. It is not obvious sadness. It is rather a silent tension, a need for the day to pass quickly. That's why many adults say, "I don't like to celebrate my birthday," without knowing exactly why. They don't feel anger. They don't feel sorrow. They feel neutrality. And that neutrality is, in reality, an emotional armor. The brain learned something very clear in childhood. Don't expect recognition, because it won't come. So instead of reliving the old disappointment, it chooses to ignore the date completely. It is not coldness. It is emotional survival. And what is most unsettling is that this behavior usually extends to other areas of life. Not asking for help, not celebrating achievements, not expecting recognition. Everything is born from the same point, a childhood where being seen was not guaranteed. After a childhood in which no attention was paid to birthdays, the brain not only learned not to expect them, but developed an even deeper response. Avoiding being the center of attention. For many people, being observed doesn't generate joy, but discomfort. When someone proposes celebrating their birthday, the first reaction isn't enthusiasm, but tension. The body contracts. The mind looks for an exit. Phrases appear like, "It's not necessary. It's just another day. I don't like to call attention to myself." But behind those words, there is something deeper. In childhood, attention was inconsistent. Sometimes it didn't come, or it came accompanied by pressure, expectations, or criticism. The child learned that being visible is not always safe, that when everyone is looking, something can go wrong. Thus, over the years, visibility is associated with vulnerability. Celebrating a birthday involves exposing oneself, listening to praise, receiving gestures, allowing others to focus on you. And for someone who grew up emotionally invisible, that exposure feels strange, even threatening, not because they don't deserve it, but because they don't know how to sustain it. Psychology explains that these people usually develop a self-protection mechanism, minimizing their own importance, not standing out, not inconveniencing anyone with their presence. Canceling celebrations becomes a way of maintaining emotional control. If there is no attention, there is no risk. That's why, when someone insists on celebrating their birthday, they may feel uncomfortable, irritable, or even guilty. It's not a rejection of others. It's a fear of occupying a space that, in the past, was never granted to them in a stable way. This avoidance is not arrogance or social disinterest. It is the result of years of learning that staying in the background is safer than being seen, that going unnoticed hurts less than exposing oneself to possible disappointment. And so, the birthday stops being a celebration. It transforms into a situation that the nervous system wants to avoid. Not for lack of self-love, but because of an emotional history that taught them to hide. With time, the rejection of attention transforms into something even more silent and profound. The feeling of not deserving to be celebrated. For these people, the birthday doesn't awaken joy, but an uncomfortable question that is never formulated out loud. Why should anyone celebrate my existence? It's not a conscious question. It lives in the back of the mind, molded by years of emotional lack. When during childhood no one made a real effort to mark that day, the implicit message was clear. Your presence is not as important as you think. And the childhood brain, extremely sensitive, absorbed it without questioning. In adulthood, this belief manifests in subtle ways, minimizing one's own achievements, underplaying gestures of affection, feeling uncomfortable when someone organizes something too big for their birthday. Not because they don't appreciate it, but because it doesn't fit with the internal image they have of themselves. Psychology describes this pattern as a reduced self-image, where the person learns to occupy little emotional space, not asking for too much, not expecting too much, not receiving too much. Celebrating a birthday, then, is perceived as an excess, something that doesn't correspond. Even when someone close tries to surprise them, a mixture of gratitude and guilt appears. Gratitude for the gesture. Guilt for feeling like they are asking for more than they should. This ambivalence generates discomfort and often leads to avoiding any kind of celebration altogether. It's not about modesty. It's about an early wound that taught them that affection is limited and that receiving it can be inappropriate or selfish. Thus, rejecting the birthday becomes a way to maintain consistency with that internal belief. I am not someone who should be celebrated. But this feeling doesn't stem from current reality, but from a past emotional history that continues to influence how the person perceives themselves. A history where recognition was scarce and validation was intermittent or non-existent. For many of these people, the birthday doesn't only involve attention, but something much more unsettling: emotional expectations. Accepting a celebration means accepting that others expect something in return: smiles, enthusiasm, visible gratitude. And for someone who has learned to contain their emotions since childhood, that demand is exhausting. During childhood, expressing emotions might have been useless or even dangerous. Maybe no one responded. Maybe they were ignored, or even worse, minimized. Over time, the person learned to protect themselves by reducing their emotional reactions to the minimum necessary. In adulthood, this adaptation remains. Showing too much emotion generates anxiety, not because it doesn't exist, but because they didn't learn how to manage it in a safe environment. The birthday, then, becomes a situation of high emotional risk. Too many eyes, too many expectations, too many reactions that should appear. That is why many prefer to avoid it completely. They don't want to disappoint anyone. They don't want to seem cold, ungrateful, or distant. But they also don't want to force themselves to play an emotional role that they don't feel naturally. Psychology explains that this pattern arises when affection in childhood was unpredictable. The person learns that emotions generate obligations and that it is safer not to raise expectations in others. Thus, rejecting the celebration becomes a form of self-protection. Saying, "I don't like to celebrate my birthday," is in reality an elegant way of saying, "I don't know how to handle everything that others expect me to feel." And although from the outside it looks like indifference, deep down there is a silent struggle between the desire for connection and the fear of not being emotionally up to what that connection demands. Behind the rejection of celebrating a birthday, there also exists a silent but powerful need: control. For these people, controlling their emotional environment is a form of learned survival. When in the past they couldn't control how others reacted, whether they would receive support, indifference, or disappointment, they learned to depend only on themselves. Celebrating a birthday involves ceding part of that control. It means accepting surprises, unpredictable reactions, gestures that cannot be regulated. For someone who has built their emotional stability on self-sufficiency, that loss of control is deeply uncomfortable. These people usually feel safer when no one expects anything from them, and when they expect nothing from others. A birthday breaks that balance. It introduces an external variable that can alter their carefully constructed calm. Psychology points out that this trait is common in people who grew up having to mature too early. By not being able to fully trust external emotional support, they developed a strong internal independence, not because they didn't want care, but because they learned that depending was risky. That is why rejecting celebrations is not an act of coldness. It is a way to maintain intact an emotional structure that has allowed them to function for years. Controlling when, how, and with whom they connect emotionally offers them a sense of security they are not willing to sacrifice. From the outside, this attitude can be interpreted as distance or detachment. But from the inside, it is consistency. It is the way in which these people protect their internal balance against situations they feel are unpredictable. Thus, avoiding a birthday doesn't mean rejecting others. It means choosing a space where nothing overflows, where emotions don't get out of control, and where the person can continue to be faithful to the way they learned to survive. Rejecting a birthday doesn't mean rejecting affection. It means often protecting an emotional identity built with effort. For these people, a birthday is not a neutral date. It's a mirror. It reflects expectations, memories, comparisons, and an attention that isn't always comforting. Where others see celebration, they perceive exposure. Where others feel joy, they feel pressure. Psychology explains that when someone has learned to regulate themselves in solitude, any event that concentrates external emotions can be experienced as an invasion, not because they don't value those around them, but because they have learned that their stability depends on maintaining clear boundaries. Therefore, avoiding this date is not immaturity or emotional coldness. It is internal consistency. It is choosing calm instead of noise, control instead of uncertainty, silence instead of the expectations of others. Understanding this changes the perspective. It is no longer about judging the person who doesn't want to celebrate, but about understanding what emotional history lies behind it. Every rejection hides a previous experience. Every boundary, a lesson learned. Perhaps more than insisting on celebrating, the true show of affection is to respect that choice. Because for some people, the greatest gift is not a party, but the freedom to live that day exactly as they need.